Hey guys, welcome back to Thrills Reading Nook. Today we have an author interview for you all. I will be interviewing Gwen Strauss. She is the author of The Nine, and I have really fallen in love with this book. It's a really exhilarating book at times, and then a devastating book at various times. Saddening and horrifying and everything, and it's just an amazing book. Gwen will be joining us in some short time. Um, for an intro about this book, it's written on the back cover that the gripping, previously untold the World War II story of nine female resistance fighters, which is basically the French resistance. It was called the La Resistance at the time. Fighters who banded together to survive the camps and ultimately escaped from a final death march across war-torn Germany is something that she's written about. Gwen Strauss's poems, short stories, and essays have appeared in numerous journals, including the New Republic, the London Sunday Times, New England Review, and the Kenyon Review. And she's also published a collection of poetry, Trail of Stones. She was born and spent her early years in Haiti, just quite near to us in US. Strauss lives in southern France, where she is the director of the artist residency program at the Dora Maar House. Hey, Gwen.
Hi.
I was just giving an introduction about you. I really have fallen in love with your book ever since I read it for the first time, and oh my God, it's such a powerfully written book. At certain
Thank you.
amount of times, I'm sorry, but I had to keep the book down because it was just a bit too much for me. Reading about all the horrifying experiences that your great aunt and everyone suffered. Would you please? Let me just give a short introduction about you. Your poems, short essays, and short stories have been published in various journals, and you publish a collection of poetry, Trail of Stones, as well. You were born and spent your early years in Haiti, and you live in southern France, where you're the director of the artist residency program at the Dora Maar House. Gwen, if you wouldn't mind, can we start with how did you get the inspiration of writing this book?
Okay. And thank you so much for having me. I want to thank you, Dhruv, and it's really wonderful that you contacted me, and I'm very honored to talk about the book, and thank you for
Thank
your
you.
kind comments. Um, so yeah, the book really started a long time ago in 2002. I had lunch with my grandmother and my great aunt Hélène, and Hélène just started to talk to me about this story, and it was something that she hadn't really spoken about before, or at least not to anyone, not to very many people, perhaps privately with to my grandmother maybe, and maybe with to her husband, my uncle. And it was sort of astonishing when she started to tell me the story of the escape. And so I said, I asked her if I could come and record it just to have it, archived. And she agreed. And a few days later, or maybe it was even a couple weeks later, I went with my other aunt and we recorded it. We sat with Hélène for a good maybe 4 or 5 hours and talked and recorded and then made a transcript. And then that was it. I mean, I hadn't really expected to do anything more with it than that. I just thought it was an important story to to conserve. But then I had
Right.
children, I had jobs, and I had, other things going on,
Right.
um, and it was later. It was really, it's slowly. It was kind of a thing that built over time because what slowly happened was I ran the story that my aunt told was had holes in it. It didn't have the full story. Like she didn't know the names of the other women. She didn't really explain exactly where she was or where they went. So there were a lot of details that were missing.
Right.
And I ran into a book that was published a few years after that, which seemed to tell the same story from one of the other women. And it turned out it was Zaza's book. So that really helped because then suddenly there had two points of view. And then slowly another iteration of the story came from a Dutch woman, Lon. These Dutch
Right.
filmmakers came to do a film with Hélène. So there was 3 points of view and, so it was that kind of thing, and as a writer, the different points of view are really interesting
Right.
because that exploration of how people perceive reality or what happened is really fascinating. So it sort of was that slowly, and then I think for me, really the catalyst finally was, the elections in 2016, and there was those protests in Charlottesville, with neo-Nazis,
Right.
and I felt a kind of urgency about the story. I really didn't think it would be a novel, I thought it would be an essay, like an article. So I went back to Germany. I went to Germany with my daughter to try to trace the route, and the idea was that I was gonna write a 2,000-word essay on it, and
Wow.
it just became this other story. Yeah.
Wow. 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 That's so inspiring to hear. So, you talk about collecting all the other works from various other authors, and all the various blind women whose story was equally horrifying for all. Can you talk about how you went about gathering all the information, and
Yeah.
how this kind of developed into a novel?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really not a historian, so it was kind of I was learning how to do history and nonfiction writing as I was doing the research. So what happened really was when I did that trip with my daughter, we went to Leipzig and the labor camp where the women had all been together as a group before they escaped. And
Right.
at that camp now it's like an environmental science campus, but there's a teeny little trailer in the corner, which is the Leipzig Slave Labor Memorial Camp. No, Slave Labor Memorial Site or something like that. And it was funny because actually to get into this huge enclosure, which was the former slave camp or labor camp, there were all these barriers. You had to have badges and stuff like that. I think it was, the scientists had to, and so I couldn't figure out how to get in, and so um, we were falling behind a car, when the barrier lifted. I just went behind him. My daughter was screaming at me, "You can't do that, it's against the rules." And I was sort of like, "They held her here against her, will for, a year and a
Yeah.
half. I can come
Yeah.
in." I was like, I kind of had this moment of like, I have to go. Anyway, so we went to the trailer, which was this little museum, and there I met the archivist. It was a lovely woman, and gave her my aunt's name and birth date, um, and she said she would look for her, and a few days later, maybe it was even the next day, she emailed me, these, Nazi records, that
Oh,
had my aunt's name on it, and it was very powerful to get that document on my computer, to see really my aunt, with the really that she was really
right.
there, and that document actually helped me start to uncover things because I saw Suzanne Modet's name, I saw Lon's name, I started to re and it wasn't alphabetical order, it was really like who was standing next to who?
Right.
So they were actually quite grouped together, the women. I didn't know their full names, I didn't actually know their last names, I didn't many of them I didn't know until quite recently, it was a whole process to figure out who these 8 women were, I mean, 9 women were, the 8 other women.
Right.
Um, and, but that was the beginning of kind of this, kind of light bulb going off in my head thinking, "Oh, there's these things called archives, and there are these records," and the Germans are
Wow.
famously really big record keepers.
Right.
There's more information I could find if I want to. So for a while, what I did was just, online archives, and also you can write to, there's a few, archives about Nazi archives, you can write to them, and they will send you all the
Okay.
information, and I slowly was finding this stuff out, and then I realized I really had to, try to interview some of the families. I'd obviously interviewed my aunt, but there were all these other women's families, and that was for me, I was kind of shy, and I thought people would just say, "What?" "Leave us alone," "Who are you?" So I wrote these really, I spent hours writing one letter to one person, just trying to figure out, like, the right tone to explain what I'm trying to do, because I didn't, like, even have a book contract. I didn't know what I was doing, actually. I was just trying to find out the story, but I wanted to be honest that I was a writer and that, anyway, everybody was so nice. Pretty much to a person, they were completely interested in talking to me. Most of them said, "But I don't have any information." She never talked about it. And I just said, "Well, let me come and talk anyway." And of course, once you start talking to them, they did have information. They just didn't know it. And that was really, for me, really great because I interviewed these different families and these different people. I met some wonderful people. Everyone was super generous, giving me photographs,
Wow.
and even the little details that they had really enriched the story. And then, little that by little that sort of builds. One family led me to another woman who I hadn't been able to find. Um, one of the other families helped me find, and it was really, almost became like a collaborative effort in a way.
Wow. Wow.
And I could have actually, really, I could have kept researching because there's one person in the nine that I don't know a lot about, which is José. She kind of disappears after the war. There's a little tiny trace of her, but I don't know what happened to her. I don't know, and I didn't find any of her family to interview. And if I hadn't had a book contract and if I hadn't had a deadline to write the book, I would be doing that now. And I might have been able to find out all about her and,
Right.
make the story more complete. I love researching now. I found out I love doing that. That's kind of what I love archives. I love the active archivists. I think that they're really like incredibly valiant people. I really had a lot of admiration for them. So that was actually a lovely discovery for me as a writer who usually makes up everything. You know?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Right. Wow. That's really amazing to hear. Uh, Gwen, my next question is you you mentioned in your book how your how your great aunt, I'm sorry,
Mhm.
was really a great mathematician. Like she wrote beautiful mathematics equations across the walls of her prison, and how she suffered various um, tortures on her, but her maths kept her alive, kind of. And something like that has happened in Indian historical past as well, where poems keep people alive or something like that about the freedom revolutionaries. Um, um, Jose, she had a beautiful voice and everything, and various people had various things. Can you talk a little more about that?
That's a beautiful question, Andrew, but I think that's a really great observation. I, yeah, she actually wrote the equation out when I interviewed her,
Wow.
60 years later. So, and it's a very complicated equation. It's the Gaussian integral. It's finding the integers of, I mean, I'm not a mathematician. I know this now from my sister who is one. Um, Finding the square root of pi, trying to find transcendental numbers, imaginary numbers. Yeah, so she used that as a way to kind of, I think, transport herself to keep her mind active and the kind of take away the walls of the prison. There was this other world that she could explore and kind of be transported through math. And I think you're right that Jose really used singing, and people
Right.
were transported by the sound of her voice and this beautiful, beautiful singing voice, which is mentioned even in her military record. It's so she had a very singular singing voice. And others used poetry. Others, I think, in the book I talk about, did recipes, just recited
Right.
recipes, cooking recipes, which was really quite a beautiful story because it's a little told one, but that, when people are really hungry, they love to talk about food, which you sort of, to me, it's counterintuitive, but apparently it's the way it is.
Right.
And that they find relief in describing in total detail how you make, a elaborate meal or elaborate cake or something. A lot of the recipes that they made or that they made by reciting were, rich in sugar and milk and eggs and butter, all the things that they were craving, and their bodies were obviously they were in starvation.
Yeah.
And so one person would recite the making of recipes slowly with every single detail, and everybody would sit and they would talk about that as if they ate a meal together. And they would have awards for the best cook, and then they would write them down and made these recipe books. And it's not in my book, but there's this really beautiful story that I came across when I was researching this whole concept of these recipe books, which to me is another way that they would have a kind of transportation out of they would be transported out of the horror of the now into this
Right.
this more communal space, more loving space. Um, there was a woman, her name is Mina Pacher. She was Czech. She was in Theresienstadt. She died there. But before she died, she had written a recipe book. And as she was dying in the camp, she gave this book to somebody and said, Make sure it gets to my daughter." Her daughter was in Palestine. was Palestine at the time. Um, and this person, this man who got the book, it took him a long time to get it to her. It was hard to find her. Anyway, it took something like 40 years before the daughter received the book. And suddenly, out of nowhere, she's now living in New York City. She gets this book, and it's her mother's handwriting. Her mother who had died in the camps. And in the beginning, it says, take care of these recipes. This is
Wow.
our history, something like that. The daughter was so. She said it was such a shock to see this, to see her mother's handwriting, that she quickly closed the book and she put it in her bookshelf behind her other books. She couldn't even look at it. It was just too crazy.
Yeah.
But she eventually was talked to about it with a friend of hers who was a famous cookbook editor, and the woman was, couldn't believe it, but nobody wanted to publish it because who would talk about recipe books written in concentration camps? That's like sort of
Yeah.
horrifying in a way. But eventually, this person found a woman who was another survivor of that same refugee camp, of that same concentration camp from Theresienstadt, and they did finally publish the book. But it's a really kind of a beautiful story because it's a little bit about how this mother was trying to save their culture, was trying to save their meals, trying to save like what the family shared, and pass that on to the next generation, which is so important. Like
Right.
this passing of the and she finally, from the grave, that happened. That was able to happen. And I feel like in some small way, my writing the story was that same idea of like trying to pass this story on to my children, and so that so what they survived and what they went through is not forgotten.
Wow.
But yeah, but I think that what you're saying is true, that the women really found these ways of transporting themselves as these ways of solidarity, of holding each other in the darkest times, and that really helped them survive.
Wow. Wow. That's a great answer. Thank you for that. Um, I um, these people, men and women, both, who died in these concentration camps, unfortunately, have become just a number now. They
Mm,
had their own stories and everything, but they've kind of become just a number. And okay, we say that okay, these many people died, but
that's
they
right.
had all of them had a backstory. And what I want to ask you is, you've explored 9 different stories, and you've explored them all beautifully in your book.
Thank you.
Um, what did you feel like when they did something like that happen to you? Like they from a number, they suddenly transform to actual
Mhm.
live stories.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think that yes, we have a way of reducing the Holocaust to 6 million Jews killed or whatever. I mean, that's it. And the way you can say it so easily, it's sort of, whatever, or any of these genocides that our humanity has constantly um, throwing up. But the point is, yeah, these people are more than numbers. They're each individual people. It's an individual story. Who knows what we've lost? We will never know
Yeah.
what humanity has lost. And I think that it's really important to, yes, in a way, to keep your eye on just sort of the humanity of one person. It's much easier to sympathize with one person than it is with 6 million in a weird
Right.
way. Like, and what really struck me in the research of the book and the reading about all of this, on the one hand, you're like, I was often overwhelmed by the horror and often overwhelmed, I'd have to put down the books and like go for a walk because I thought, wow, this is really painful material. But the other side of it, amongst this incredible landscape of devastation and horror, you would find, or I would find, individual acts of just incredible courage and bravery and kindness.
Right.
And they would be equally beautiful and overwhelming in a way on the other side, like, they really balance it out. I've talked about this, thought about it, and I don't really haven't completely formulated my ideas about it, but I feel like this sort of mm, the mass cruelty of humanity, the mass genocides, the mass killings are often done by the state. They're sort of on a governmental or sort of a large functioning
Right.
bureaucracy level. But the deepest kindness and empathy is done on the individual level. So somehow we have to find that balance, because we have to find the way that those individual acts supersede this mass organized machine. Um,
Right.
because they are just as powerful. I mean, It's amazing that, some of the things that people did in order to save each other. It is really, truly, it's like the best of humanity you see in these camps. Things that I don't know if I would be capable of doing. I don't know if I would be that generous.
Right.
Then you see these people that just do this stuff, and and that should have equal weight. That should have equal power in our minds to to the sort of horrific, killing machine of war.
That's really amazing too.
Mhm.
That's something, yeah. Um, uh, pe People, you've written in your book, especially towards the end, how women actually stayed back to help the Germans because they thought.
Mhm.
I was astounded to read that because I would have felt myself if I would have been in their shoes, and I don't like
Mhm.
I'm not placing myself in their shoes or anything,
Mhm.
but if I would have been in their shoes, I would have developed an animosity towards the entire German population. Be it,
Mhm.
I would
Mhm.
have immediately gotten built to be like, okay, all of these people are bad, but no,
Right.
they understood that okay, not all people are bad. Some of them were horrifying, but not all of
Right.
them are like that. Can you like
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, that was a really important point that I think my aunt Hélène, my great aunt, wanted to make to me when she was telling me the story, because she really emphasized to me that the German soldiers, the everyday foot soldiers, were basically just people. The SS were to her, in her mind, the SS, the ones who ran the camps, and they were sort of terrorizing the whole country. That the German people themselves were oppressed and terrorized by this Gestapo and the SS in the secret police in Germany. And if you read about Germany's the years coming up to the war, you see how that happens. This whole apparatus was put in this. It's fascism. This whole
right,
apparatus is put in place where everybody has to tell on everybody else. Everybody's paranoid. Nobody can trust anyone, and they're all just basically scared. And they behave in a way that when people are frightened, you don't often behave very well. So they behave in these ways that are not their truest self, and in a kind of frenzy of fear. And then she had experienced this kindness, the guard, um, Fritz Stupitz in the museum that really, I mean, in Leipzig, that really tried to help her escape, um, who she then goes to afterwards. I mean, I think she felt great, uh, grateful. She felt grateful to him because he had brought them. I mean, I don't put a lot of this in the book because but he brought them food. He brought them all kinds of things besides, he brought them potatoes, he brought them there he had been helping her and her group of friends, and at great risk to himself. He would have been hung if he'd been caught. So she she recognized his humanity. She recognized that he was trapped in the same way that she was. And it kind of reminds me of any of these kind of systematic fascistic systems like slavery in America, or apartheid, or the both sides become equally kind of trapped in these roles that are dehumanizing. So
right,
the enslaved person is totally dehumanized, obviously, because that's the nature of being enslaved. But the master is also dehumanized because they're losing the best part of themselves in maintaining this kind of status quo. So I think she had a really profound sense of that, and also she spoke fluently. She spoke all these languages, so she could talk to all these different people. She spoke Russian and German and Polish and English and French, and all fluently. So she had this. She could speak with them, and she couldn't then say, "Hello there." It's easier to think of the other as evil if you don't even know what they're saying to each other. If it's a really foreign language. And um, so when I interviewed her, she was very emphatic about that Fritz Stupitz was a good man, that there were good people, that the common people that they met in some of the villages were good, and some of them were terrible. They never knew which they were going to find. Um, that the sort of deserted soldiers were really kind, um, and they were like hiding from the German army, those soldiers. So um, it's just it's I think people behave in all the different ways. It's all the possibilities are there, and it's it's easy thinking in nationalities and groups of people, that's always a danger because it's sort of, um, you know, simplifies everything, but I get it. I mean, that's probably how I would how I had seen it until I really started to read about it. I definitely had seen it sort of in black and white. Even in the camps, even amongst the prisoners, there were gradations of, you know, how people behaved, how generous they were and how much they risked and how much they were just out for themselves. And these women had all probably been turned in as resistance people by many of them by people who had turned on them, their friends, their neighbors, so they recognize it's complicated. It's complicated how people behave. You never really know how you're going to
Right.
behave, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if I answered the question. I got sidetracked, but
No, it's okay. Uh, your book is really so so much full of content and so much like emotions, and like even talking to you right now, I have had goosebumps on multiple times, and
that's kind of you.
um, um, what I want to ask you is, Angela Merkel, actually, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing her name wrong, but she had recently um, um, uh, issued an apology about whatever had happened in German past. Does it matter anymore? Is it of
Mm.
importance? Because
I
what has
think I
happened
think
has happened.
I mean, I think it does matter. I changed this opinion over writing this book. When I first started writing the book, I had a lot of skepticism about the whole idea of these memorials, about these camps, I thought of it as dark tourism. I thought it was kind of a prurient thing that people went to these places to just sort of, say they'd gone there and then a kind of a moral equivalency, like, okay, I can't be a bad person because I went to Auschwitz, it's
Yeah.
sort of like an easy pass. And and I have problems with Israel, so I thought like, they're using the Holocaust to to behave badly towards the Palestinian people, or I had a really simplified take on it all. And or not simplified, but anyway, that was my take. But I grew as I was doing the research to realize a few things, and one of them for me is that it's important to explore the truth. It's important to tell the stories. I feel like as a human race, we are our stories.
Right.
How we The stories that we tell each other about ourselves matter, you know, and that they honor the truth and the honor as much as we can approach the truth, and that they honor the suffering that's real. That matters. I was just really moved by the archivists, the people who try to save the truth and have it be told. If we lose that, if we like allow these stories to be hijacked and then used as propaganda and then told in another way, um, we kind of completely erase the humanity of the people already who died, but also our own humanity. We just become these sort of flattened out. It's easier and easier then to just have a very black and white flat view of the world. Like the stories keep us complicated and make us think. That's important. I just realized in a way these sites that it was really huge for me to go to Buchenwald and Ravensbrück. It changed my life. I think those places are important for that. I think the archives are important for that, because you think is this a little scrap of paper that says nothing, but someone 100 years from now will read that paper and it'll be like, oh, that makes sense. They'll be able to construct the story in a way. I'm very there's Holocaust deniers, for example, just as there are people who deny the evils of colonialism, or
Right.
the people who deny, that slavery was that bad, or what does that do if we let those kind of narratives just be told? And even in the Holocaust, there's parts of the stories that haven't yet really been fully told, and that's why I think it's important for someone like Angela Merkel to say, we're sorry, because it wasn't until 1982 that it was acknowledged that there was a Gypsies genocide, or a Roma and Sinti people genocide in the Holocaust. That wasn't even part of the story, and not until the 80s were Jews mentioned at Auschwitz. Auschwitz was in part of the Soviet Union, and the narrative of Auschwitz was that it was a camp of the proletariat fighting against the imperialist West. And the fact that there was a Jewish genocide didn't enter into it. The crematoriums where most of the Jews died has been sold and is now private property. The the borders of the camp, so these things matter. Like I think it's kind of, if I tell you that, it makes you like, wow, how could that be? Well, it can be
Yeah.
because whoever decides to tell the story gets to kind of efface, well, they get to tell the story. They get to, so I think it really does matter. I think it matters to, even if it's past, even if it's, Faulkner said, the past is not the past. The past is never, how's it go? The past is never dead. It's not even past, or the past is never over. It's not even the past. I mean, basically, we are our past, is what I'm trying to say. Like we are haunted constantly, and we're even more haunted if we don't acknowledge it. Like then we're condemned to repeat it and to. I mean, I think really the history of wars is how wars never end. They just
Right.
keep being reenacted over and over again through generations, and the trauma that causes, it gets reenacted. So we have to find some way, however minute each person can do, to try to move away from that. I don't
Great.
know if we'll get there, but we have to try.
Great.
I,
Uh, Kind of my last question here, but
Mhm.
I just wanted to ask you why the overall on a digital spectrum, if you see in matter of books or on movies or in TV shows for that matter, why do you think there have been and equal number of men and women died and equal number of men and women had their own stories and everything, but there have been a lot more movies about men, such as The Pianist or the Schindler's List or Band of Brothers and so on and so forth, but there have been
Yeah,
so many books and so many movies and so on about men who died, but not a lot of things about women who died, and women who
yeah,
took part in the double World War II, and women who were suffering
mm,
in these Auschwitz camps and horrifying
yeah.
camps and so on. So why do you think
Well,
that?
yeah. I mean, that's sexism. Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, it's a really important part of the story, for me. These women, none of them spoke about it afterwards. There was actually a kind of shamefulness about being a young woman who had been in the camps. There was a question about, whether she was pure. There were marriages that were called off. It was these women came back and were expected, just don't talk about it. Just forget it. Like even in my own family, I have my tante Hélène, who was this resistance hero who has all these medals, and the man she was to marry later, my uncle Danny, who was a really well-known hero. There's books about him. It was talked about in the family, and what he did was great. I don't want to say it wasn't. Like he was a real war hero. But her story wasn't spoken about even in the family. Even so it was seen as unfeminine. It was seen as unwomanly. It was seen as also sort of bandstanding, like taking the glory when the men needed the glory. It was seen as women should just be quiet, and I think there was just a kind of there was a shame. It was a shameful thing, to have. There was something about it, like somehow you were doing these women weren't supposed they were young, they weren't supposed to be doing that. That wasn't how people wanted to see them. It's also important to remember that in France, women didn't have the right to vote until 1944, near the end of the war. And the reason they got the right to vote is that it was obvious that they had played a huge role in the resistance, and you couldn't
Right.
then not let them vote. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think that's a big part of the rectifying of the story of the narrative. There were a lot of women in the resistance, and there were just recently. There's a new museum that's opened up in Paris, Place d'Enfer Rochereau. It's a museum of the liberation of Paris, and so it's about the resistance in the liberation. There's not a single woman mentioned, and
Wow.
I know of the women that were in that fight. Lucy Aubrac, her husband has a whole little situation, and she was his partner completely, and they don't even mention her name. The people who did that museum are of an older generation. They don't even think about that. They didn't, in this day and age, they still thought it was okay that they could present a whole museum without a single female hero, as if the women weren't part of that story. And they were. I mean, it's sort of known that they were. So it's interesting. It's a lot.
Right.
It's a big battle. I think. yeah, it's part of what I hope my book helps, and I hope that there are many more books about it, and I hope that there'll be other film and TV shows, and that will, because in a many way, I think I talk about this in my book. In a lot of ways, the women were able to do more than the men because they were seen as being uh, helpless, and the Germans didn't expect them to be part of the resistance, and because of that, the women, young women, did a lot and were really endangered a lot, and died doing things that the men couldn't get away with. So um, it's really an important part of the story. I just finished reading a book about three Dutch women in the young, starting at 17 in the resistance, who were incredible, and one of them was killed, but who is just now starting to be recognized. So yeah, it's a really important part of the story that still needs to, history has to be
Evolving.
told over and over again. We don't get there right away, get it right. And a lot of the women kept quiet until there started to be the Holocaust deniers in like the 80s. And that's when a lot of the women who had never spoken about it started to speak up, because they thought this was too much. They couldn't let someone hijack the story, and they often said because they knew the women who had died in those gas chambers, and they didn't want to have their deaths be erased.
Uh, um, uh, Sorry for not ending this interview on
A positive note.
a good note. To just ask you kind of the last question here, but these women did finally come back to their families. The 9 women, especially the 9 women, came back to their families, and
Mhm.
that was kind of happy. Not like a truly happy reunion, but kind of a happy
Mhm.
reunion with their families, and meeting them would have been a
Mhm.
really good time, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's great about the story is that they all survived, and they all survived with each other's help. And many of the women in the group went on to have important careers as professional women and had children and everything. I think the other side of the story is, which is the same thing for men who come back from war, um, they were traumatized, and
Right.
they weren't allowed to talk about it, and they really had this strong bond with each other, and some of them said that was when they felt the most, seen, was when they were with each other. But when they were, I think that's your phone. When they were, uh, when they were, I lost my train of thought. Sorry. It was hard for them to, be, part of the regular life sometimes,
Right.
and sometimes they weren't. Yeah, so they came back, and then they had there were good parts about it, and there were also difficult parts about it, that they were haunted in some ways. So that is another part of, I think, when Lon wrote her book, and when Hélène talked to me, and I think perhaps a little bit for Suzanne, telling their stories helped. Whenever they were able to finally speak them, it helped too. But it's a good story. I mean, they survived. They
Yeah.
made their way. Um, and they helped each other survive. So, and they did have some reunions near the end that were quite moving. They're quite beautiful to see them together.
Thank you for taking the time to speak to me, Gwen. It's
Sure.
been really, your book was quite numbing, and quite goose like I had goosebumps on various times and reading the book and while speaking to you. Thank you for taking so much time to speak to me. It really means a
Sure.
lot.
Thank you.
And
Thank
your
you so
book
much.
came out in early May,
That's right.
and I encourage my viewers to go and read your book, because it's really, really one of the best reads that I've ever read.
Oh, that's so kind of you. It's lovely to talk with you. Thank you for having me.
Thank
And,
you.
it's been great. I love talking about it. So thank you so much.
Thank you,
Really.
Gwen.
Thanks a lot. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.